My name is Valentina Cruz. I am 34 years old, and I used to believe that if you worked hard enough, quietly enough, and asked for nothing in return, your family would eventually see you. I was wrong. I grew up understanding that families have hierarchies. Not every parent says it out loud, but you feel it early. The way a room rearranges itself when one child walks in versus another, the way a phone call gets answered on the second ring for one sibling and goes to voicemail for you. I felt it by the time I was 8. I had named it, accepted it, and quietly decided I would outlast it by becoming indispensable. My father, Rodrigo Cruz, built a mid-sized property management company in Sacramento over 30 years. 41 residential units, 3 small commercial leases, 1 storage facility on the eastern edge of the valley. Nothing that would make the front page of any business journal, but enough that the family lived well, enough that his name carried weight in certain rooms in certain parts of the city. He had a way of entering a space and letting the silence organize itself around him. I watched him do it for 3 decades and took notes, though he never knew that. If you have ever come home for a holiday already braced for something you cannot name, you know exactly what that drive felt like. That particular silence in the car where you are watching exit signs and doing math about how many hours until you can leave. My mother, Dolores, ran the household with the precision of someone who had converted domestic labor into its own form of authority. She kept the books for the company in the early years before my father hired a proper accountant. She remembered every number, every loan, every tenant dispute, every repair invoice from 1991 onward. She also remembered which of her 3 children had disappointed her and in what specific ways, and she kept that ledger with equal care. My sister, Patricia, was the oldest. 38, married to a man named Glenn who sold insurance and coached youth soccer, and had never once in 11 years of marriage offered to pick up a dinner check without my father suggesting it first. Patricia had 2 children, Mia, 9, and Cooper, 7, and a 4-bedroom house in Folsom that my parents had co-signed the mortgage on. She called my mother every day. Sometimes twice. She sent photos of the children constantly, holiday cards printed on thick cardstock, small gifts for no occasion. She was very good at the maintenance of warmth, and I had long ago stopped resenting her for it because it was a real skill and she had practiced it longer than I had. My brother, Danny, was 29 and the youngest. He worked in a loosely defined role at my father's company that had evolved from helping out after college into something that appeared on no organizational chart but drew a salary. He was charming and well-liked and had inherited my father's way of taking up space in a room. He had also, in 5 years of quasi-employment, generated 2 tenant complaints, 1 near miss on a missed property tax filing that I had caught and corrected, and a lease renewal that had been signed with the wrong annual escalation clause that I had renegotiated at no charge to the company. Nobody had mentioned any of that to my father. I had not mentioned it either. I was the middle child. I had a degree in real estate finance from UC Davis and a second credential in trust and estate administration that I had completed at night over 2 years while managing a full caseload at the firm where I worked. I had been at Kellerman and Associates for 6 years, handling estate planning and asset protection for clients whose portfolios ran between $800,000 and $8 million. I knew what trusts looked like from the inside. I knew what they could do and what they could be made to do. I knew how quickly they could be amended. My son, Marco, was 5 years old. His father and I had separated 2 years prior, amicably enough that we still shared school pickup without requiring a mediator. Marco was quiet in the way that observant children are quiet. He noticed things and stored them and produced them later at unexpected moments with great precision. He had his father's dark eyes and my habit of folding his hands in his lap when he was thinking hard about something. He was the best thing I had ever done and the only thing in my life I had never second-guessed. We drove up to Sacramento on the 23rd of December. I had booked us into a hotel 4 blocks from my parents' house. The Hampton, nothing extravagant, 2 queen beds, because the last time I had stayed in my childhood bedroom with Marco, we had both been kept awake until 1 in the morning by the sound of Glenn's voice carrying through the walls as he told my father about a new investment opportunity. And I had decided then that I was done performing the ritual of the whole family under one roof. My parents had said nothing about the hotel. That was its own kind of message, but I had stopped trying to decode those years ago. ACT 2, first dismissal. Christmas Eve at my parents' house followed a structure that had not materially changed in my adult lifetime. My mother cooked for 2 days before the meal. My father sat in his chair in the living room and received guests. Patricia arrived early and helped arrange things in a way that was mostly decorative, but that my mother narrated to everyone who came through the door. Danny arrived last, always, and was greeted with a particular loosening of my father's posture that I recognized as relief, as though Danny's presence completed something. I arrived at 11 in the morning on the 24th with Marco in his good sweater and a ceramic dish of tamales I had made from scratch the night before at the hotel using the small electric griddle I had packed specifically because my mother had, in 3 of the last 4 years, made a version of the comment that I did not cook. Not cruelly. Just observationally, in the register she used for all her cruelties, as though she were simply reporting a known fact to anyone who might find it useful. I set the tamales on the kitchen counter. My mother looked at them. She said, "Oh, you bought some." I said, "I made them." She said, "They look a little dry," and moved them to the far end of the counter near the recycling bin. I squared the dish in front of me and said nothing. My father came in from the living room to refill his coffee and saw me. He said, "Valentina," the way he always said my name. Not unkindly, but with a slight forward lean, as though he were confirming I was actually there and not simply expected to be. He asked about the drive. I told him it was fine. He nodded and went back to his chair. Patricia was in the dining room with Mia and Cooper, arranging the children's place settings with a cheerfulness that I recognized as both genuine and strategic. She looked up when I came in and smiled and said, "Val, oh good, Marco is going to love it. Mom went a little overboard this year." She said it lightly. She said it the way you say something when you have already processed that what you are describing is a problem but have decided in advance not to make it one. I asked what she meant. She waved her hand toward the living room where the tree was. She just got a lot for the kids this year. It's fine. It's Christmas. The gifts under the tree were stacked in a way that required some structural engineering. I counted without meaning to. It is an occupational habit, enumeration, and I reached 36 before I stopped because Marco had come in from the front hall where Danny had been showing him something on his phone, and Marco was looking at the tree with the focused, careful attention of a child who is making sense of a new environment. I looked at the tags. Mia. Cooper. Mia. Cooper. Mia. Cooper. Back through the stack, Mia, Cooper, Cooper, Mia. I went through all of them. Marco's name was not on any of them. I went to my mother in the kitchen. I kept my voice low. I asked if Marco's gifts were somewhere else, upstairs in a closet set aside. She looked at me. Something moved across her face that was not quite surprise and not quite guilt. It was something closer to the expression of a person who has been caught making a calculation they had hoped would go unnoticed. She said, "I thought you were getting him things from Santa." I didn't know I was supposed to. I said, "Mom. He's 5. He's your grandson." She said, "Patricia's children are here every weekend. I know what they need. I don't see Marco very often." She said it the way she always said things that were designed to land as my fault. Gently, with a reasonableness in the framing that made it hard to name what was actually happening. "You could have told me what he wanted." I pressed my thumbnail into my palm and said nothing. My father, who had heard enough of this from the hallway, came in and said, "Dolores, just find him something." He said it the way he said most things that were technically interventions but carried no actual commitment, a statement designed to end the scene without changing the outcome. He looked at me with a mild exasperation that I understood was directed at the situation's inconvenience rather than at its cause. Then he went back to his chair. My mother found a gift bag from Patricia's children's hall, a set of art supplies that Mia had received as a duplicate, removed the tag with Mia's name on it, wrote Marco in her own handwriting on a new tag, and placed it under the tree. I watched her do this. Marco did not know. He was 5. When he opened it that evening, he said thank you with great sincerity and immediately began organizing the colored pencils by shade, which was so completely him that my throat tightened without my permission, and I had to look at the middle distance for a moment before I could look at anything else. ACT 3 Flashback, Pattern plus Labor Inventory. That night, in the hotel room after Marco fell asleep with 3 of the colored pencils still clutched loosely in his hand, I lay on top of the covers and did what I always did when something happened at my parents' house that I could not immediately categorize. I went back through the archive. Not because I was looking for grievance. Because I was a person who needed to understand the pattern before I could make a decision about it. The first incident I always came back to was the graduation. Not my law school graduation, I had not gone to law school, but my UC Davis commencement in May of 2012. I had finished in 3.5 years, carrying 18 units per semester in my final year because I wanted out, and I had a job offer that started in August, and I had calculated that finishing early saved me $11,000 in housing costs. My father had not come. He had a conference in Phoenix, a real estate investors association event he attended every year, and when I said I was graduating a semester early, he had said, genuinely, "I thought you had another year." When I explained, he said he was proud of me and that we would celebrate when he got back. We had dinner at a restaurant of his choosing. He paid. He did not ask about the job. Patricia's college graduation, 4 years earlier, had involved a party in the backyard, a tent rental, 47 guests, and a cake with her name and the university seal reproduced in blue frosting. I had been 14. I had helped my mother address the envelopes for the invitations by hand. The second incident I came back to was the loan that was not called a loan. In 2016, my parents had needed a new roof on their primary residence and a repair on the storage facility's drainage system simultaneously. Total cost, after getting 3 quotes, came to approximately $68,000. My father's business account was carrying a short-term cash flow gap because 3 tenants had been slow to pay and a refinance was in process. He asked me to cover it temporarily. Just bridge it for a few months, you know how these things go. I had $71,000 in a savings account I had been building for 4 years toward a down payment on a property of my own. I transferred $68,000 without a written agreement because he was my father and I was 26, and I still believed at that point that some things did not require documentation within a family. The refinance closed. I waited. 4 months later I asked carefully when he thought the repayment would happen. He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "The $68,000. For the roof and the drainage." He looked at me with genuine confusion and said, "Valentina, that was a contribution to the family. I didn't ask you for a loan." I sat with that for a long time. I thought about what I knew about how documents worked and what happened when they did not exist. I filed it. For the next 7 years I contributed in ways that I made sure to document for myself even when I could not document them with him. I had reviewed the lease agreements for all 41 residential units in 2018 when my father's property manager quit suddenly and the renewal cycle was 3 weeks out. I worked through the previous manager's files for 11 evenings, identified 4 leases with missing escalation clauses and 2 with incorrect security deposit language, corrected all 6, and had them executed before the deadline. I had never billed for that. I had never mentioned it. I had drafted the amendment to the company's operating agreement in 2019 when Danny was informally added to the payroll, and my father wanted the language updated. I did it over a weekend. A business attorney would have charged between $1,500 and $3,500 for that work. I did it because my father asked, and because I knew how to do it, and because I still believed, then, that competence demonstrated within a family eventually becomes visible. I had found the error in the property tax assessment on the commercial units in 2020, a clerical misclassification that had resulted in an overpayment of approximately $14,000 over 3 years. I had filed the correction, navigated the appeals process, and recovered $11,200 in a refund that arrived the following spring. My father said, "Good catch," and moved on. I had updated the beneficiary structure on my parents' primary life insurance policies in 2021 after my mother mentioned, casually, that she thought they might be out of date. They were. Significantly. The original designations named accounts that had been closed and an attorney who had retired. I spent 3 hours on the phone with the insurer and 3 more filling out the correction paperwork. My mother said, "That's what you do for work, isn't it?" Yes. It was. But I had not sent them an invoice. The deepest thing I had done, the thing I came back to last that night in the hotel room, was the trust. In 2020, at the beginning of a year that had made everyone briefly terrified about what they were leaving behind and to whom, my father had finally agreed to do what I had been quietly suggesting for 3 years: formalize the estate plan. He did not want to use a stranger. He asked if I could handle it. I could. It was within my credential scope, and I had done it for clients with comparable asset profiles many times. I told him I would need him to be honest with me about everything. Every account, every property, every debt, every informal arrangement, and he had nodded, and for 3 months he had actually been honest with me. I built the trust. I structured it to minimize estate tax exposure, protect the residential portfolio from probate, and allow for a controlled transfer of the business interest over time with appropriate liquidity provisions. I named the beneficiaries as he instructed. I noted privately what the document said and what it could be made to say if the trustee, which was me, the named successor trustee, ever needed to exercise that role. I had never said this out loud to anyone. I lay in the hotel room and listened to Marco breathe and thought about the regifted art supplies and the tag in my mother's handwriting and my father's voice saying just find him something, and I understood that nothing had changed and nothing was going to change on its own. I was 34 years old, and I had been making contributions to this family for 12 years in ways that no one had asked me to account for, because they had assumed I was simply available to provide them. I was the successor trustee. I thought about that for a long time. ACT-4 triggering incident. Christmas morning began with my mother's cinnamon rolls, which she made from scratch every year, and which were genuinely excellent, and which I had never once been able to compliment without the compliment being rerouted. Patricia's recipe, my mother said when I mentioned them, though I had been in this kitchen enough times to know that the recipe was from a laminated card that had come with a stand mixer purchased in 1998, and that Patricia had nothing to do with it. Marco sat between Mia and Cooper on the living room floor and opened his art supplies with the same seriousness he'd given them the night before, refolding the tissue paper carefully as he went. Mia had a remote control horse that made sounds. Cooper had a drone that my father had to be talked out of flying indoors. There were sweaters, games, a jewelry kit, a set of building blocks, a book series in a matching slipcase, 2 stuffed animals, a small telescope, and various other items still in their boxes along the wall. Marco's gift total, including the regifted art supplies, was 1. No one said anything about this. Not Patricia. Not Danny, who arrived at 9:30 with coffee and his girlfriend and immediately got absorbed into helping my father with the drone. Not my mother, who moved through the room with the particular serenity of someone who has decided that the current arrangement is reasonable. After breakfast, my father asked me to come into his study. I knew what this was. He used the study for conversations he wanted to frame as serious, as though the desk and the bookshelves lent them weight. He said, "I wanted to talk to you about the trust." I sat down. I waited. He said, "Danny has been working hard this year. He's really stepped up." He paused. "I've been thinking it might make sense to adjust some of the distributions. To reflect that." I looked at the shelf behind him where a row of binders held copies of old lease files. I had reorganized those binders in 2018. "In what direction?" I said. He said, "I think Danny should have a larger share of the business interest going forward. He's going to be the one running things. It makes sense for the structure to reflect that." I said, "What share are you proposing?" He said, "I was thinking 75% to him, and then the remainder split between you and Patricia." He said it the way he said most things that affected other people's lives, with a reasonableness in the presentation that assumed agreement was the appropriate response. "You have your career. You don't need the business. Patricia has Glenn. Danny is the one who's going to carry this forward." I thought about the 11 evenings reviewing lease files. The $68,000 that had become a contribution. The trust document I had built, the one he was now casually proposing to amend. I said, "I'd want to see any proposed amendments in writing before anything is executed." He said, "Of course. I just wanted to give you a heads up." He said it like he was doing me a favor. Like a heads up was a thing you gave someone before you rearranged something they had built. I said, "I appreciate that." I went back to the living room. Marco had finished with the colored pencils and was now showing Mia a drawing he had made of something that appeared to be a very serious-looking dog. Mia was nodding with appropriate gravity. My mother came in from the kitchen and said, to no one in particular, "We should do this more often. It's so nice when everyone is together." I looked at Marco. I thought about the tag in my mother's handwriting. I thought about my father's study and the word remainder and the binders I had sorted on my hands and knees on the floor of that room in a summer 3 weeks after a tenant had flooded a unit and the property manager had quit. I said to Marco, "Start getting your things, buddy. We're going to head back to the hotel and get some rest." He looked up. He said, "Okay," with no complaint, which was one of the things I loved most about him, his uncanny ability to accept transitions without drama. My mother said, "Already? You just got here." I said, "We've been here since 11 yesterday morning." She said, "Well, it would be nice if you stayed." I helped Marco into his jacket. I zipped it up from the bottom slowly the way he liked and smoothed the collar. He picked up his colored pencils and tucked them into the front pocket of his backpack. I said goodbye to everyone. I shook my father's hand, which is what we did, and kissed my mother on the cheek and hugged Patricia and Danny. I did all of it with the completeness of someone who understands they may not be back for a while. We walked to the car. Marco asked if we could stop for hot chocolate on the way back. I said yes. I was already thinking about what I was going to do when I got to the hotel and opened my laptop. I did not open my laptop that night. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed after Marco fell asleep, and I thought about the word remainder for a long time. I thought about what it meant that my father had used that word, not your share or your portion but the remainder, as though my interest in what I had built were a rounding error, a figure arrived at after the real allocations had already been decided. I thought about the art supplies and the handwritten tag and my mother's voice saying I didn't know I was supposed to. I opened my laptop. I pulled up the trust document. I read it the way I read everything I had written for clients, carefully, without sentimentality, as a professional reviewing a legal instrument rather than a daughter reviewing the terms under which her family had organized their affections. The document was exactly as I had written it. The successor trustee was named. The amendment provisions were clearly stated. The process by which distributions could be modified required the written consent of the trustee, which was currently my father, as the primary, but in the event that the primary trustee wished to make a material change to the distribution schedule, the successor trustee had a 15-day review window and the right to object on the grounds of breach of fiduciary duty to any named beneficiary. I was the named successor trustee. Marco was a named beneficiary. I read that section 3 times. Then I closed the laptop and went to sleep. ACT 5, Climax. The call came on the 26th at 9:14 in the morning as Marco and I were eating breakfast at a diner 2 blocks from the hotel. My father's name on the screen. I let it ring once, set my fork down and answered. He said, "Valentina. I wanted to talk more about what we discussed yesterday." I said, "All right." He said he had been thinking about it more and that he felt it was important to move on the amendment relatively soon. He said Danny had some plans for the business, expansion ideas, new units, and that having the ownership structure settled would help with financing. He said he hoped I understood. I said, "I'd like to come by the house this afternoon, to talk through it properly." He paused. He had expected, I think, a phone conversation, something he could manage at distance from his chair. He said, "Sure. Come by around 2. I arrived at 2 with a leather portfolio that I had carried since my first year at Kellerman and Associates. It was tan, worn at the corners, with a brass clasp that had never fully caught since 2019. Inside it I had the trust document, printed in full. I had a 1-page amendment summary I had drafted that morning. I had a second document that I had spent the better part of the previous night preparing, which I did not yet take out. My mother was in the kitchen. Patricia had gone back to Folsom. Danny was there. He had apparently been called in, which meant my father had anticipated some version of this conversation being more than a quick agreement. We sat at the dining room table. My father at the head. Danny to his left. Me across from Danny, the portfolio closed in front of me. my father said. I appreciate you coming back. I know it's a drive. I said, it's not a problem. He said, I've talked to Danny about what I have in mind. He's going to take on a bigger operational role. The financing he's working on will require him to have majority interest on paper. It's just a structural thing. Danny said, it's really just for the bank. It doesn't change anything between us. I looked at Danny. I had spent 11 evenings in 2018 correcting his filing errors. I did not say this. I said, I want to make sure I understand what's being proposed. You want to transfer 75% of the business interest to Danny, leaving Patricia and me to split the remainder. My father said, that's right. I said, and this would be done by amending the trust. He said, yes. I unclasped the portfolio. I took out the trust document and laid it on the table between us, turned so he could read it. I said, this is the trust as it currently stands. The one I built for you in 2020. He nodded. I said, I want to read you one section. I found the page. I read the amendment provision aloud, including the successor trustees review window and the fiduciary duty clause. I read it at a normal pace, the way I would read it to a client. My father said nothing. I reached back into the portfolio. I produced the second document, the one I had prepared the night before, and placed it on the table next to the trust. I said, this is a formal notice of my intention to object to the proposed amendment on the grounds that it materially reduces the beneficial interest of a named trust beneficiary, Marco Cruz, without adequate justification or compensatory provision. Danny said, wait, what? I said, Marco is a named beneficiary in this trust. Any material reduction in the distributions available to his mother's share directly affects his beneficial interest. I have standing to object as successor trustee, and I am exercising that standing. My father looked at the document. He looked at me. He said, Valentina, this is a family matter. I said, yes. It's also a legal instrument that I drafted, signed, and am named in. Those two things are both true at the same time. My mother had come to the doorway. She was holding a dish towel. She said, what's happening? My father said, it's fine, Dolores. I said, there's one more thing. I reached into the portfolio a final time. I placed a third document on the table, a single page, clean, formatted. I said, this is my resignation as successor trustee, effective upon the execution of the proposed amendment. If you proceed with the change as described, you will need to name a replacement trustee. Any estate attorney you hire to execute the amendment will charge between $3,500 and $8,000 for the full document review and re-execution. They will also likely flag the fiduciary issue I have flagged, and they will tell you the same thing I am telling you now, except they will bill you by the hour for it. The room was quiet. Danny said, Dad, she can't just. My father held up one hand. Danny stopped. My father looked at the three documents arranged in front of him. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, you came prepared. I said, I always do. ACT 6, Aftermath/Exit Statements/Fallout. My father asked my mother to give us a few minutes. She disappeared into the kitchen and did not entirely disappear. I could hear the particular quality of her silence, the kind that listens. Danny said, this isn't what I expected. I said, I know. He said, I wasn't trying to cut you out. Dad said it was just about the bank. I looked at him. I thought about the lease renewal with the wrong escalation clause. I thought about the property tax overpayment I had recovered. I said, Danny, I know you weren't. I turned to my father. What I said next I had organized in my head the night before, after I closed the laptop, lying in the dark listening to Marco breathe. I had not written it down. I did not need to. I said, Dad, I want to tell you what I heard over the last 2 days, and then I want to tell you what was actually happening while you were saying it. He said nothing. He set his hands flat on the table. I said, yesterday morning in this house, Mom looked at the tamales I made from scratch and said they looked dry and moved them to the back of the counter. What was actually happening is that I had packed a griddle in my luggage so I could make something from our family's recipe because I wanted Marco to see me do that. I have been doing things like that for this family for 12 years. He was still. I said, 2 days ago you told me that when I transferred $68,000 in 2016, that was a contribution to the family, not a loan, and that you had never asked me for a loan. What was actually happening is that I gave you every dollar I had saved toward my first property so that your roof and your drainage system could be repaired without interrupting your refinance. I have never asked you to repay it. I am not asking now. I am telling you what it was. Danny had gone very quiet. He was looking at the table. I said, yesterday afternoon you told me that I have my career, that I don't need the business, and that Danny is the one who is going to carry things forward. What was actually happening, during those same years that Danny was carrying things forward, is that I corrected 6 lease agreements in 11 evenings so that your renewal cycle didn't collapse. I drafted the operating agreement amendment that added Danny to the payroll. I found the tax assessment error and recovered $11,200 for the company. I built this trust document, which is sitting in front of you right now, from scratch over 3 months at no charge. I did all of it because you asked me to, or because I saw it needed doing and I could do it. I paused. I squared the papers in front of me. I said, and this morning before I came here I counted the gifts under that tree. 36 for Mia and Cooper. 1 for Marco with a tag in Mom's handwriting because it used to have Mia's name on it. I zipped his jacket and we left quietly because he is 5 years old and he did not need to understand what was happening in that room. But I understood it. I have always understood it. My father's jaw moved once, like he was going to say something. He didn't. I said, I'm not resigning from the trust today. I'm not signing anything today. What I am doing is giving you the same thing you gave me yesterday, a heads up. I wanted you to have it. I put the 3 documents back into the portfolio. I closed the clasp, it didn't catch, same as always, and I stood up. Danny said, Val. I said, I'll see you, Danny. I walked past my mother in the kitchen doorway. She had the dish towel pressed against her sternum with both hands. Her eyes were doing something I did not have a name for. I kissed her on the cheek, the same as that morning, and went to get my coat. I was in the car when my phone began to move. My father first, at 4:47 p.m. Then Danny. Then, at some point in the evening that I did not track in real time, my mother, though I only learned the number later when Patricia told me. By midnight, 77 missed calls between the 3 of them combined. Patricia herself called once at 9, and when I answered she said, What did you do? And I said, I told him what I had been doing, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Okay, in the voice of someone who has known something for a long time and is relieved to have it spoken. The call I did take at 5:12 p.m. was my father. He asked if we could talk. I said yes. He said, I need to move some money before the end of the quarter. I was going to ask you to help coordinate. He paused. There's about $3,000 in a holding account that needs to transfer to the operating fund. I said, Call your accountant, Dad. He said, Valentina. I said, Merry Christmas, and ended the call. ACT 7, Reflective Epilogue. Marco and I drove back to our apartment in Davis 2 days after Christmas. He slept most of the way with his backpack on his lap, the colored pencils zipped safely inside. I drove and let the valley open up around me, the flat gray farmland, the irrigation channels running silver in the winter light, and I thought about what I had spent 12 years believing about families and work and visibility. I had believed that contribution was its own argument. That if you did the work, the real work, the unsexy work, the work that prevented disasters nobody ever heard about, eventually the people you did it for would factor it into how they saw you. I had believed this the way you believe things that are never quite tested. Theoretically, at a distance, without examining what you would do if the test came back negative. The test had come back negative many times. I had kept believing anyway, which I understood now was not patience or loyalty. It was a form of hope that had outlasted its evidence. What I had done at that table was not revenge. I want to be careful about that word because it carries a heat that was not in the room when I laid those 3 documents down. What I had done was closer to accounting. A final, honest ledger of what had been given and what had been named and what had quietly been absorbed into the background of a family that ran on the assumption that some people's contributions were just the weather, ambient and unworthy of remark. I had been the weather for a long time. I was done being the weather. The trust still stands as I wrote it. My father has not proposed the amendment again. Patricia and I speak more now. Real conversations, not the maintenance calls, and she said something to me in January that I have thought about since. I always knew you were keeping things running. I should have said so. I told her that it would have helped. She said she knew. Marco started a new colored pencil drawing in February. An elaborate map of an imaginary country, with roads and rivers and a capital city he named after himself, which I found so completely reasonable that I hung it on the refrigerator without a word. Whatever you have been carrying in your own family, the work that goes unseen, the contribution that gets absorbed, the moment where you finally decide to put the ledger on the table, I hope you find the steadiness to do it the way it needs to be done. Not loudly. Not with a door slam. Just with the documents in order and your voice at its normal pitch, saying plainly what is true. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. The people who need it most are usually the ones who have been quietly keeping something running for a very long time. This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, and events are entirely fictional and do not represent any real persons or situations.